A 1965 Gibson stereo, you say? Welcome back, troglodytes, to your daily dose of guitar information, the Trogly's Guitar Show. I love myself a good mystery listing. This one was posted up on eBay and was too good not to share. Mainly because it's been heavily modified. Because at quick first glance, we're missing a knob here. It looks like somebody put a Kaler on it. It's got a non-original case that kind of looks like what Ibanez was using. But despite those modifications, so far it seems to be legit. So first off, how do you identify factory Kalers? Because Gibson briefly used those in the early to mid 80s, and back then they were called the Supertune Vibrola. And they're actually pretty easy to retrofit, because this part of the bridge fits over top of the old bridge studs. In fact, it utilizes a similar thing to set the height. And then you can utilize the existing tailpiece studs. The downside being, you have to do this to your guitar. But most stock Kalers will actually have the Gibson branding on it, and the cavity will have finish in it. It will not be bare. A great way to tell vintage from modern pickups is you want to look at the edges of them. If they're nice and rounded over like this and not overly sharp, you have a fighting chance that they could be older. Now obviously, in a perfect world, you can remove these outside 4 screws and check and look at the back plates and identify them from there. But in situations like these where you just have to go off of a hunch outside of asking the seller, that's a good detail to look for. But remember, there's vintage reissue pickups that try to mimic that as well. But so far the wear and tear we're seeing here seems to line up with the age and vibe of the rest of the guitar. But now we get to the headstock. This is something that you had to have looked at many of examples for it to be able to tell you anything, but this is the 70s style Gibson headstock veneer. In stereo, typically you would not find that on a Les Paul Custom. That doesn't mean that I don't own a Les Paul Custom stereo. That was a thing that kind of existed. But for something to be stereo in the 70s, you would have to have 2 output jacks on the side. Which, looking over here, it's only got 1. And that looks like an import style output jack plate. You know, made in Japan style stuff. Are we sure this is authentic? But you gotta watch out. Sometimes people put Gibson headstock veneers on made in Japan replicas that are pretty good looking, and then you get scammed. So your next best bet is to go to the back of the headstock. Thankfully, we've got a pretty decent shot that shows us a serial number of 6579, looks like 89. And then we can see our Made in USA stamp, and we can also see these 2 lines running up and down the neck. So that tells us this is a 3-piece neck, and having a Made in USA stamp in general also tells us what era this was produced in. The very earliest this thing could be is 1969. Between the years 1962 through 1967, the Les Paul didn't exist at all, so that's why seeing that 65 Les Paul Custom piqued my interest. But they say, according to the serial number, that's how they got the 65 date. I'm not sure if they just read that and thought that's how it worked, or perhaps they came over to like the Guitar Dater project, where they will tell you a whole bunch of different stuff. But unfortunately, I hate to break it to you, early 70s serial numbers don't mean much of anything. You cannot date the guitar based on them. In this era, you want to look in the backside control cavity and look for the pot codes. It'll say 137 or 134 XXXX. The first 2 digits will tell you the year. So for example, if it was 1377245, that would be 1972, 45th week of the year. That would be the absolute earliest the guitar could have been produced. It's the most reliable way to get a semi-what accurate date on a late 60s, early 70s Les Paul, because it's not till 1977 when we get the beautiful year, year production number sequence. And then from there, you can further nail it down based on like what other specs we have. Like Gibson didn't start using this style of tuner until about 1975. I mean, are there some outliers? Yes. But if you ever see these tuners stock, you can pretty much guarantee it's around 75. However, I do see a filled in hole here, so I'm not quite convinced that's even the original set. But typically, when you're trying to date in early 70s, it's normally going to be 73, 74, or 75, because there was just a lot more of those ones made. So that was my thought process on this one when I first saw it, and I wanted to find some more photos to see if I could help them even further. But then this happened. Pancake body separation. You don't see it all that often. So pancake bodies get introduced in 1969. That's when they take one piece of mahogany, they put a laminating maple in between them, they slap them together, and occasionally abused examples do come apart. Typically, this has something to do with moisture damage, or like somebody was intentionally trying to separate it. Do not fear pancake bodies. Usually the worst you get is like a small line. But this whole thing is just absolutely coming apart, which is rather unfortunate. So now we gotta answer, what's a circa 1975-ish Les Paul custom with a pancake body that's completely separated, that's been routed out for a Kaler, and has a few original parts left on it? Unfortunately, the answer is not 17,500, but they probably thought it was a 65. They were looking at 68, 69s. I totally understand how they came up with that price. Who knows, maybe they found it in their grandma's attic, because that is a suspiciously old-looking couch/curtain thing over there. I know this thing looks grim. However, if these pickups are still original T-tops, they're worth about $800 on their own. And despite the husk being in such bad shape, I still think somebody would pay about $1,000 for them. So I would say a rough estimate of about $1,500 is what this could be worth as it sits today. Because overall, that's a pretty clean separation. All you need is a little bit more glue. Nobody will ever know once you refinish it. And hey, wouldn't you know it, they did eventually revise their listing, calling it a 1970s, which is very safe, and the price got revised to $2,500 and somebody snagged a deal by making an offer. But I've got some more fun for you guys tonight, but first we need to hear a word from our sponsor, Sweetwater. Sweetwater is a great place to buy your stuff, but it's not just guitars. You can also buy amps, effects pedals, patch leads, whatever you need for general music making. They also sell tons of guitar parts, pickups, knobs, anything you might need for a project guitar like our episode tonight. They are your place, and they're happy to ship it to your door, or you can visit their Fort Wayne, Indiana location. And if you happen to be local, they have tons of events all the time. They also do monthly giveaways that you can follow the link in the description to become a part of. Thank you, Sweetwater, for being a continuous sponsor of my show. And now let's get back to our guitar. But while we're on the topic of crazy project guitars, here's another one I've been meaning to tackle. It's listed as a vintage Gibson Explorer electric guitar with case. Okay. Old Explorers, when they get modified, you gotta be careful, because even more so than the lawsuit era Les Pauls, people can make really convincing fakes. So whenever I see something like this, instantly I'm like, oh boy. But this one's an extra oh boy. So first off, this all looks very rough, right? But it's mainly just because we're missing the pickguard that hides all this ugly stuff usually. However, this is something that just comes from experience. That long neck tenon is just not right for a Gibson guitar. You might enjoy checking out my 1976 Gibson Explorer, the limited edition that we documented in new old stock shape. You can see what it looks like underneath the pickguard. And then from there you can tell that the routes right here are not correct. So real Explorers do have a little area that go in here, but then it kind of all connects together. There's not like a separate little shelf. We can't really judge the whole ABR1 bridge situation, but what is just absolutely hilarious and worthy of featuring this thing, even though it's not a Gibson at all, is, look, they threw a Floyd Rose on it. That's just fantastic. I love how obnoxiously low it sits on the body, and they just left the tailpiece studs there. That's my favorite feature about this thing. Oh my goodness. It's got two bridges. It doesn't need the ABR1. This is where you set your intonation. So there's no way this thing's staying in tune, right? Because it's basically just acting like a Jazzmaster's vibrola. But now come over here and check out our knobs. Just not spaced properly at all. And then, hey, let's throw a mini switch in between them as if it's not already crammed enough. Now, I will say, this body wood looks all right. It's attractive, but that is not what the mahogany looked like that Gibson was using at this time. And hey, we've got cool binding. Now, as far as our pickups, I mean, if you're lucky, that could be a DiMarzio, but doesn't look like it. And then we've got some sort of a passive EMG in the bridge. Then we can flip over to the backside. You can see their makeshift trem system. Man, they went through so much trouble to put that thing in there. How could they not realize that they were just messing up by having the whole double bridges? Because as far as hacked in trem systems I've seen, they didn't do the worst job on the back there. And then once again, I'm pretty sure that's an Ibanez case, isn't it? We'd seen a very similar case in the Trey Tuesday series on that Hondo Death Dagger, so maybe it's a Hondo. I don't see any branding on it right now, but it honestly looks pretty good. But then we get to the headstock. Yeah, somebody put Gibson on it, but it's definitely not Gibson. Like, we got some high-performance-esque truss rod cover going on. Really ugly nut. I don't think we need to talk too much more about that. But here's the one saving grace to this one. It's got like $200 tuners on it. Somebody put the real Gibson branded Schallers on here. Oh, and apparently this thing has a bad headstock repair too. Oh man, I feel bad. I feel bad for this thing. But if you're curious, how else do you know it's not a Gibson? Explorer necks are crafted with 3 pieces. So you get your main neck piece that usually goes along here, and then it kind of turns into a triangle. Because typically the Gibsons will have a small headstock wing, kind of like they do for the Les Paul, on the edge of the tuner over here. It won't be quite that thick. And then they'll have another piece over here. So this apparently just has one big piece connected to the neck and then another one thrown on there. We come over here, we can see it's got a scarf joint. So yeah, definitely not Gibson. Does that have a multi-layered fretboard? It just might. And oh, hey, we do have some sort of a pick guard included. This is new. eBay is allowing videos. Hey, at least it works. So if you're nice, the tuners are worth $100. I think that husk might be worth $50 to someone. Case, maybe $100 if we're being really generous. When this one was first listed, I'm pretty sure it was like $5,000, then it's come down a couple of times. So if you could pick that up at like $300, I think it could potentially be a fun little project. But sadly, it looks like it got relisted in an auction and somebody overpaid, probably thinking it was a Gibson. Although maybe they know something I don't about that case, and maybe it's worth a lot more. Sometimes you can get really lucky in auctions that are just strange, and they have some rare, obscure part on them that makes it worth so much more. And on that note, my friends, I will say goodnight. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll catch you tomorrow on the next one. Take care. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, consider subscribing. I post videos like this every day. And you might even enjoy this next one.